All right, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. My name is Brenda Schufelt, and I'm the History Room Coordinator at the Hudson Area Library. And welcome to A Layered Landscape, Indigenous Land and Colonial Property by BJ Lillis. We'll be presenting tonight. This is our first of the 2015 Leisler lectures that we have, which we're very grateful for. The Jacob Leisler Institute for Early New York History is located on Green Street in Hudson, and we collaborate on a lot of projects together. Definitely the 4 lectures that we have every year. We're very glad for them. These programs are free and open to the public, and all our library programs are, but we do have a donation box in the back if you would like to donate. And we also have a sign-up sheet on the small table right by the door. And that is for our monthly newsletter and also the Leisler Institute newsletter. So you can fill that out if you don't receive them. And I want to let you know about a couple of special events that are going to happen at the library. The first one is Thursday, March 6th at 6 p.m. will be the opening reception of Hudson, A History of Whaling and Maritime Commerce. And yeah, I'm very excited about this. We've been working on it for almost 2 years. It's a 3-sided exhibition that we're doing in collaboration with the Hendrick Hudson chapter of the DAR and the Columbia County Historical Society. And we've been doing a lot of research at a lot of institutions in the Northeast area and gathering documents specific to Hudson and bringing them here, at least in digital facsimile form, so that they can be in our repository of all 3 institutions, and also we'll be utilizing them for the exhibition. So we're opening on March 6th, and the DAR will have a 1-day opening on February 22nd that will discuss the patriots that were whalers and also women in whaling. And we have found, I think it's 5 women that were specific to Hudson that were the wives of whalers that we have some information about. So the DAR will be presenting that. And then March 22nd, they'll have more of a full exhibit about women in whaling. And sometime in June, the Columbia County Historical Society will be opening their exhibition. They will have the Essex and Herman Melville exhibition in one of their rooms in the museum building. And there's another exhibition where they have a full timeline that will contextualize whaling in Hudson with what was going on nationally and internationally. So there's a lot of work being done. And in conjunction with that, Carl Mattson, the man behind the camera, is going to be releasing our whaling video that goes along with this exhibition sometime in February, about the middle of February. We'll introduce that to you. Also, for those of you who saw February 2nd, we had a program with African American Archives of Columbia County that was with Fergus Bordowich and Ed Klingler about the Van Hoosen House. And that's changed now. The date had to be changed to March 9th. So we'll have that in our newsletter and it'll be on our website, but there's no more February 2nd program, just so you know. So now David Voorhees, the founder and director of the Leisler Institute, will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Brenda. It is again with appreciation that I thank the Hudson Area Library for hosting the Jacob Leisler Institute's lecture series. This series, which introduces the latest scholarship into colonial New York and New Jersey, is made possible through the generous support of the Van Dyke Family Foundation, the Hudson River Bank and Trust Foundation, and the Bank of Greene County Charitable Foundation, as well as numerous private donors. Tonight's lecturer will be of special interest to those in our area, for their topic touches upon the manorial lands which shaped the British colonial period of the region. BJ Lillis is a Hench postdoctoral fellow at the American Antiquarian Society in Worcester, Massachusetts. They completed their PhD in history at Princeton University in 2024. The project, A Valley Between Worlds, Slavery, Dispossession, and the Creation of a Settler Colonial Society in the Hudson River Valley, 1674 to 1766, brings together the histories of Atlantic slavery, Indigenous North America, and English, Dutch, and German colonialism to explore the contested relationship between land, labor, and property in the 18th century. This evening's talk traces Indigenous survival and resistance to colonialism on Hudson Valley manors from the early 18th century to the 1760s, when an unlikely alliance between tenant farmers and native peoples organized tenant uprisings, rent strikes, and coordinated legal action against Hudson Valley landlords. Please help me welcome BJ Lillis.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for coming out on this very bitterly cold night. I also want to take a moment and thank David Voorhees and the Leisler Institute for inviting me, the Hudson Area Library for hosting, Brenda and Paul for helping get me set up, and Carl for filming. So I'm going to dive right in. Today I'm going to be talking, as my title suggests, about indigenous land and colonial property and the way that these two things depend on each other in colonial New York. I'm going to talk about how indigenous landscapes become incorporated, quite literally written into the records of colonial property. I'm going to talk about indigenous Mohican and Wappinger people and Dutch and English colonists, and how their respective relationships to land shaped the terms of their relationships with each other. My talk, I feel I should prepare you, spans quite a long amount of time. I'm going to start in the 1680s when New York's first large manors were established, and talk a little bit about what a manor was, what they looked like, why they're important. Then I'm going to talk about two communities, the Wappingers and the Mohicans, and how they basically worked both with and in opposition to colonists in the 18th century as manor lords sort of developed their Hudson Valley estates. And then finally, I'm going to end about 80 years after I started, racing through time in the 1760s, when some landlords took a much more aggressive approach to developing and managing their land. And at that point, in the mid-1760s, both tenant farmers and indigenous communities protested these changes. Tenant farmers organized a rent strike, marched, and ultimately openly rebelled against legal authority. And at the same time, the Wappingers and Mohicans chose to defend their land rights within the imperial legal system and actually traveled to London to do that. But before I get into these stories, I want to take a moment and situate us in time and space a little bit. And this is perhaps not quite as necessary here in Hudson, New York, as it would be for an audience outside of the Hudson Valley. But if the landscape of the Hudson Valley is maybe a little bit familiar to us all here, a little self-aggrandizement never hurt anybody. And so we'll just talk for a moment about why the Hudson Valley is so unique and interesting in the colonial period. So as many of you know, the Hudson River has a unique hydrology, right? Geographically, below Albany, the river is maybe not even a river at all in one sense. It's a tidal estuary. And so basically, right, the tide runs all the way from New York Harbor up to Albany. And what this means is that a ship can sail all the way from New York Harbor up to Albany. And in a sense, because of this, right, the river itself is almost like a coastline. It's a place that colonists sort of quickly have a certain kind of access to. And the Hudson Valley, you know, I love this map. This is a mid-17th century map. Obviously, they didn't quite understand where everything was, so it's not perfectly accurate. But it really shows how Europeans thought of the Northeast as a place with a bunch of rivers. That was the key thing, right? And so you see all these rivers, right? And the place that they sort of cared about was how far you could get on a boat. And often they built a city there, and often that city becomes a capital. And so, Hartford is like maybe right there, and that's like about how high up the Connecticut River you can go. And Trenton is like, here somewhere, and that's about how high up the Delaware River you can go. And then Albany is like up there, right? And so basically, this makes the Hudson Valley a sort of unique and important place. And because of that, the Dutch, who in the 17th century are ascendant, right? It's the Dutch Golden Age in Europe, picked the Hudson Valley when they tried to establish a colony in North America. And establish a colony I'm sure everyone in this room has heard of called New Netherland. So basically, by the time my talk starts at the end of the 17th century, we're looking at a newly conquered Dutch colony under English governance, located in a geographically unique and really strategically important part of North America. In part because of this unique history, right, the Hudson Valley is really markedly diverse in the colonial period. The settler population is Dutch, German, Scandinavian, French, English, Irish, Scottish. And English and Dutch, and to some extent also German, compete to be the languages of commerce, religion, education, and daily life. There's a substantial enslaved population, and enslaved Africans also might be speaking English, Dutch, German, or all three. And the indigenous Hudson Valley was also incredibly diverse. So in what's now Western New York, over like here-ish, you have the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois. They're extremely powerful in the entire colonial period, in part, right, because of this strategic position they occupy. All these rivers and the Great Lakes, which we don't see on this map, all kind of end right in Haudenosaunee territory. You have the Mohicans, who you'll be hearing about tonight. They kind of live in the Albany area. I don't know if I'm being accurate with the pointer right now. I apologize for that. On both sides of the Hudson River, down into sort of central Dutchess County, you have the Wappingers and the Esopus, Munsee-speaking people. There are other Munsee-speaking people in the lower Hudson Valley. So in short, this is like an incredibly diverse place, culturally, ethnically, and linguistically. And the reason I'm highlighting all this is because this talk is about colonists and Native people, and I'll be talking about colonists and Native people. But it's really important to remember that we can't assume very much about a person or their life just because we know they were a colonist or we know they were indigenous, right? These are incredibly diverse, expansive categories. So the book I'm writing is called A Valley Between Worlds. And in the largest sense, it's about the ways in which the Hudson Valley becomes a key connection point between a continental North American world dominated by indigenous people and an imperial Atlantic world being created by European empires. And so this is a place, right, where colonial landscapes are understood and defined and exist simultaneously to indigenous landscapes. And one of the key colonial institutions that accommodated and helped shape this layered landscape in the colonial Hudson Valley was the manor. So usually this is where I clarify that I'm not talking about table manors, but actually the kind with like lords and peasants that you might associate with medieval Europe. Again, this is a bit of a hometown audience, so I suspect a lot of you have heard of the Hudson Valley's manors. You might associate the manor with places like this, Van Cortlandt Manor House, or Phillipsburg Manor House. I love Phillipsburg Manor because you can see a lot of the sort of colonial infrastructure of a manor, the mills, the barns. But a manor isn't really a house, right? That's not really what I'm talking about. All colonial manors have a house, and often more than one house. But the manor was a kind of property. And this kind of property was a defining feature of colonial society in the Hudson Valley. And understanding what a manor was and how they worked really illuminates relationships between settlers and indigenous people. So what is a manor? A manor is a legal form of property that joins a property right, like a kind of land ownership, with limited legal jurisdiction, and then grants both of these things to an individual, a manor lord. So the borders of New York's manors were important boundaries within the colony's counties, similar to the borders of a township or a precinct. And leaseholders on a manor had the right to elect local officials and provincial legislature. So you can think of it in a way as maybe a combination of like a big town, but it kind of sort of all belongs to one person, maybe. And the manors in colonial New York were very large. So in Columbia County, where of course we are tonight, the entire county consisted of 2 manors, Livingston Manor, which is this pink square here, maybe easier to see over here actually, and the southern part of Rensselaer Manor, often called Claverack, or the lower manor. Rensselaer Spike or Rensselaer Manor is this rectangle here, it's in pink here, and then all down you have kind of manors here. You have the Phillips Highland Patent is this kind of manor that I'll talk about. Cortlandt Manor, the Beekman Patent is settled as a manor. And I really like this map, even though it's almost impossible to see the lines. And you're gonna see close-ups from this map all night, and you're gonna be annoyed with me because it's almost impossible to see the lines, but it's an incredible map. It's from 1776. And so this is the very end of the colonial period. And what I love about this map is that the map maker, wherever people actually lived or wherever people planned to live in colonial New York, colonists, settlers, he drew all kinds of lines. And in New England and New Jersey and in places that indigenous people controlled, or simply places where there weren't a lot of people, he didn't draw any lines. And so all the lines, wherever there's like tons of lines on this map, is where people actually were in the colonial period. And in that, and also this is Vermont, and so that's kind of a different deal, which we can't go into right now. So, you know, for that reason, looking at the squares on this map, right, that's Rensselaer Manor, that's Lower Rensselaer Manor, that's Livingston Manor, here's Cortlandt Manor, here's the Phillips Patent. You can see that in the context of where people actually lived, these are huge manors. It's a huge amount of the colony. So today we think of property as a kind of absolute right. Your property is your property, right? If I rent an apartment, no one's thinking, well, you kind of own it. The landlord owns it. But in the colonial period, most Europeans didn't really think that way, not yet. They understood that all land ultimately belonged to a king, and land ownership was a set of rights granted by the king to a subject. And that subject, in turn, might grant those rights to other people. And even perhaps have a kind of authority over those people, right? This is an older idea of property that's still very common in Europe. And so on New York's manors, as on manors in Europe, or manors in Ireland or England, land ownership isn't absolute. The underlying value of the land is shared between landlords and the farmers who live on the manor. And actually this fact, this kind of land ownership is really what defines a manor for colonial Americans. So even if a place is not legally designated a manor, right? Livingston Manor is legally designated as a manor, but the Beekman estate is not legally designated as a manor. But if a single family owns a large estate and they're leasing it to tenant farmers on long leases where the tenant farmers feel like they kind of own their farms, colonial Americans thought of that as a manor. So what did a manor lease look like? On Rensselaer Manor, again, this large square here, and also where we are now, down here, leases were perpetual. You probably have never heard of a perpetual lease. This is no longer a thing. A perpetual lease is sort of half lease, half deed, right? You and your heirs have the land forever, but you have to pay rent. On many other manors, leases were measured in lives. This was very common. So a lease for 3 lives means that the lease lasts as long as you, your wife, and your eldest son live. And then when your eldest son dies, you have to write up a new lease. So on manors, the rent that tenants paid, according to these long leases, was not a market relationship. It wasn't a market rent like we pay today in a rental market. It was a customary relationship. New York leaseholders paid a customary rent, the rent that everyone kind of knew was the rent. And that was between 15 and 25 Dutch shekels of wheat per year, 4 fat hens, they always say fat, and 2 days of labor, or 1 day, actually more often 1 day of labor. And because leases were so long and gave tenants so many rights, effectively on manors, the underlying value of the land was shared between landlords and tenants. Tenants required their landlord's consent to sell their farms, and then if they did sell their farm, tenants often got 2/3 or 3/4 of the price, and landlords the remaining 1/3 or 1/4. the land on colonial New York's manors was also shared with Indigenous people. Indigenous communities didn't just leave when a manor was established. They shared manorial land with tenants. And because on manors land ownership itself was sort of continually negotiated, it was totally possible for a manor lord and a tenant farmer and an Indigenous individual or community to all consider themselves, right, kind of owners of the same piece of land. So I want to, how am I doing on time? Okay. I want to take a moment now to kind of dive in. I hope you're ready to dive into some historical documents because we'll be doing it. And look closely at the legal document that actually established Livingston Manor. And I apologize that these are kind of boring copies, right? This is the 19th century printed copy. That's what I often am using in my research. On the other side is an 18th century handwritten copy of this manorial patent. So there are tons of these 17th and 18th century copies of this document, because every time the Livingston family got in a fight about what they owned or where their property lines were, they wrote up another copy of this. And so there's copies like all over the Northeast, actually, in different archives and libraries. Somewhere in the world, there's probably a copy that looks like this. This is the patent for Rensselaer Manor. It's grand and on parchment and has a big red seal, but I haven't found it for Livingston Manor. I don't know where it is, and I don't really need it, of course. What I need is just something that has the words. So historians have looked at these manorial patents for a long time, for a couple of centuries now, really. But I think people have sort of underestimated how much we can actually learn from these documents. So first, I want to look at what the Livingston family actually received from the crown in 1686. It was not just a tract of land, right? I'm going to read this from around here. You don't have to follow along. It's not that important. They received all the massages, tenements, buildings, fences, orchards, gardens, pastures, meadows, marshes, woods, underwoods, trees, timbers, quarries, rivers, runs, rivulets, brooks, ponds, lakes, streams, creeks, harbors, beaches, fishing, hawking, hunting, fowling, mines, minerals, not silver and gold mines. Those were accepted. All the rights, members, liberties, privileges, jurisdictions, royalties, hereditaments, profits, advantages, and appurtenances whatsoever. This is what they got from the crown. At first blush, this may sound like a lot of legalese, right? They're just trying to think, what are all the ways that we could say we own the land? But actually, in much of 17th century England at this time, right, the use rights and the privileges associated with these different places and practices with forests or a particular forest or a stream or fishing rights were widely distributed amongst the people in a community according to custom, according to law, according to contract. So in New York, right, the English crown is releasing its right in all of these things, except gold and silver mines, to Robert Livingston. But that didn't exactly mean that Robert Livingston got or kept them all. So first off, Indigenous people also had long established rights and relationships to these landscapes, to many of the kinds of things on that list, right? To the orchards and gardens and pastures and meadows and marshes and brooks and the hunting, right? And this document didn't erase or extinguish or replace those rights. Indigenous people still had them after this document was created, both in like a legal English sense and in practice. And also, when Livingston leased land, as I was talking about, to tenants who were getting something that was kind of like owning a farm and kind of like renting a farm, they expected to receive some, not all, but some of these things, you know, as part of that process. Maybe they'd have timber rights in some places, but not others. Maybe they could fish in this area, but not that area. Maybe they could mine this mineral, but nothing else. All of this was negotiated. So this patent was granted by New York's governor in the 1680s, an Irish Catholic and sort of career imperialist, former governor of Tangier named Thomas Dongan. I used to have a slide of him, and then I found out that there is no portrait of Thomas Dongan, and we've all been looking at his nephew for centuries. Historians have rightly argued that Livingston's colonial political connections, his relationships with Dongan and other colonial politicians, were key to getting his manor. And you know, we can see why, right? If you look at the patent for Rensselaer Manor, why people would think Thomas Dongan was pretty important. But this English legal document, this manor patent, isn't just about Livingston's colonial political connections. It's also about his indigenous political connections. Robert Livingston was New York's Secretary for Indian Affairs, actually. That was his first major political position in the colony. I have a portrait here of Robert Livingston and a Mohican Etta Ocom. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. who was actually a Mohican leader who went to London and was painted in 1710. So this might have been one of the people that Robert Livingston was talking to. And Livingston's position as Secretary of Indian Affairs, it involved a lot of note-taking, but it helped him build political relationships with both colonial officials and native leaders and diplomats, including Mohicans, who, it's worth noting, were still pretty important in the late 17th century in terms of indigenous diplomacy in North America. And Robert Livingston depended on his political, diplomatic, and personal relationships with the Mohicans to get his manor. And that fact, too, is really actually written into this document, this patent. So legally, in the 1680s, you could only get a document like this one, a deed or patent granting land from the crown, if you first proved to the colonial government that you'd already purchased the land from native people. The idea was that first you bought the land from native people, and then you bought it from the government. So Robert Livingston's problem in this light was that the Mohicans weren't interested in selling him miles and miles and miles of their land that they were still living on. And Robert Livingston wasn't really in a position to cheat the Mohicans, who were his powerful neighbors. But he was, as it turned out, sort of in a position to cheat the colonial government. So what Livingston did, let's see, he bought 2 small plots of land from the Mohicans, just a few hundred acres each. So one was somewhere around here, I think, on the Hudson River. And the other was over here around Taconic. When he presented these purchases to the governor, he acted as if they were contiguous. He acted as if they were right next to each other. He took advantage of the fact that they're both on Roloff Jansen's Kill. Obviously, it's a very long stream, but it kind of allowed him to make it sound like they were kind of all right close together. He also erased one single term in the original deed that he purchased this land from the Mohicans. There was a place called Mahaskakuk, which was a swamp or thicket that marked the eastern boundary of his purchase. And he replaced this place name with the phrase running back into the woods, which is very convenient. And so with this small erasure and elision and lie, basically, Livingston turned 1,000 acres into 20,000 acres. But Livingston wasn't really cheating the Mohicans, who knew exactly what they had sold him. He was cheating the colonial government, which couldn't interpret their own land records at all, because those land records were defined entirely in terms of indigenous landmarks and landscapes. So here we're looking at the same patent we were looking at earlier, but different pages. Sorry, in red you can see where he says that Taconic is lying and being adjacent unto the aforementioned tract of land, so that's the lie. And then running back into the woods up here is the omission. Down here in blue, you can see, this is just a small part of this document actually, but you can see all the sort of Mohican words, all the indigenous places that define the land that Livingston is supposedly getting from the colonial government. So all of these terms were deeply meaningful to the Mohicans, and they were probably pretty legible to Livingston, but none of them really had any meaning to the governor of New York or any other imperial official further away than Albany. At the same time, right, the Mohicans, as I've suggested, didn't leave the area when they sold this land, nor does it appear that Livingston expected them to. In fact, at the end of the 1680s, Livingston and the Mohicans discussed the possibility of another indigenous community called Wayatanaxi, which I haven't really been able to track in the records, probably because they would have referred to themselves by a different name, possibly. Moving onto the manor at Taconic, which would have been a huge expansion, in fact, of the indigenous population at this moment. And then the Livingstons sort of continued to quietly buy Mohican land and pay off Mohican claims for generations. In the 1720s, so like 40 years after the patent, the Livingstons purchased a number of parts of the manor from the Mohicans. And as late as 1750, Robert Livingston's grandson, Robert Jr., was renegotiating fishing rights with indigenous man named Akeem, who had a right to fish at a place called Cook Peak, where Livingston had just built a dam to supply the ironwork he was building. And Livingston gave Akeem a key that would let him raise the gate of the dam for 12 days and nights in the spring. I actually think I have a photo of this. not that it's so useful. This is written into his rent book, his agreement with Akeem. It would let him raise the gate of the dam that was supplying water to the ironworks for 12 days and nights in the spring to fish. So this is like really concrete evidence that Mohican people were living on Livingston Manor and exercising things like hunting rights and fishing rights that they hadn't sold. And in fact, we do know, although we don't know very much about it, that there was a Mohican community on Livingston Manor until at least 1793. Another consequence of all of these all of these colonial deeds being articulated in terms of indigenous landmarks was that the Livingstons and Van Rensselaers and other manorial families and their children and their grandchildren and their great-grandchildren depended on native people, Mohicans in this case, to tell them where their property started and ended. So for example, in 1712, the Van Rensselaers and Livingstons got into a debate over a monument built by the Mohicans called Mawakwanzik. It's here on this map that's supposedly from 1714, although I'm skeptical. It certainly depicts 1714, or is meant to. So you can see why the location of Mawakwanzik might matter. Surviving records suggest that this place had spiritual significance of some kind to the Mohican, and also that it marked an important indigenous political border that ran north-south. And then it was utilized in English legal documents as the east-west border between Livingston and Rensselaer Manors. So in 1712, Henry Van Rensselaer tries to claim that Mawakwanzik was not a particular place at all. It's just a word that means pile of stones, and that pile of stones was like maybe down here somewhere. And this controversy, right, is settled by local Mohicans who knew exactly where Mawakwanzik was. And this pattern you kind of see happen a few times, and I suspect it happens sometimes that we don't have records of, where a family like the Livingston is surveying, is settling people, and they've hired a surveyor, and they need Mohicans there to tell them what all those words that I underlined, all those indigenous words in their deeds, actually where those places were and what they meant. And so basically, you know, as you can see this, you can see in looking closely at these documents, a way in which the manor is sort of facilitating this layering of indigenous and colonial landscapes. So far, I think I've made relationships between indigenous people and settlers sound rather cooperative. For the Wappingers, at least, that cooperation was underwritten by a willingness to resist colonial encroachment more aggressively. I'm going to go back to the map. In much of the central Hudson Valley, manors and estates like the Livingstons and Van Rensselaers, as well as land patents granted to groups of investors like the 9 Partners patent in Dutchess County. Where did my beeper go? Oh, over here, right? Remained to a large extent Indian country into the 1720s and 30s. But at the end of the 1720s, the pace of settlement started to really pick up as colonial landowners began surveying and leasing or selling land. And in this period, the Wappingers faced colonial incursions from all sides. Here we go, yes. The Wappingers are kind of centered around the Beekman patent, the Great 9 Partners patent, the Rimbout patent, and Phillips Highland patent. This is kind of the core of their territory. And in all of these places, settlers from the Fishkill area, the Phillips family, the Beekmans, investors in the 9 Partners patent are beginning to try and survey and settle land in the 1720s and 30s. To give an example of how this plays out, in the 1720s, a local landowner named Katharina Brett, this is her house, which still exists, wanted to survey and lease out land she'd inherited near the Fishkills. And the Wappingers, quote, violently obstructed the surveyor, threatened her with bodily harm, and forced her to both pay 70 pounds and allow them to continue living on her land. Another example, in 1727, Henry Beekman purchased land at a place on his own huge manorial estate called Togpaksink from a person he called Old Nimham, a leader of the Wappingers. In Henry Beekman's view, Old Nimham's had basically forgotten. The word he uses slipped the memory that this land had been sold in the 1690s. But as we can imagine from what I've already told you, it's almost certain that the land was not sold in the 1690s. And so Henry Beekman complains, what use is it to buy land of the Indians? For if we buy, you'll still claim forever. But still, Beekman didn't actually start issuing leases to settlers on Wappinger land until 1737. So even if Beekman had kind of come to think of this land as his land, it's clear that if he wanted to write leases and develop it as a manor, he needed to negotiate that process with the Wappinger, and that took him at least a decade to accomplish. In the 1740s, the Wappingers paired this strategy with an emphasis on traditional religious practices. When some Mohicans in Dutchess County converted to Christianity in the 1740s, King Nimham, a Wappinger leader whom European missionaries called a sorcerer, offered land to any Mohican who was unhappy with this whole Christianity thing, and invited them to move south onto Wappinger territory. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is that on Livingston Manor, on the Beekman estate, on a lot of places in the Hudson Valley, land purchases were not only about alienating Mohican or Wappinger land, they were also a series of agreements, albeit made under increasingly unequal and coerced circumstances, that governed native and settler coexistence. Who could use which areas of the manor when and in what ways? Where would native people plant, fish, and hunt, and where would colonists? In the Hudson Valley in the first half of the 18th century, purchasing native land could imply coexisting with rather than replacing native people. And land records provide pretty powerful evidence of the ways in which indigenous and colonial landscapes could be overlaid. I'm doing okay on time. So in the 1750s and 60s, this entire manorial world that I've been describing, a world where colonists and indigenous people lived alongside each other on manors, where rights to land, and not just rights to land, but the landscape itself, how it was understood, how it was described, were negotiated between indigenous communities, manor lords, and tenant farmers. This world was being challenged. It was being challenged by the massive demographic growth in settler communities. I have an imperfect chart here. This chart basically shows the growth of Livingston and Beekman's, the number of leases they issued between 1730 and 1748. And then the yellow line is basically the population growth curve of Dutchess County. And so you can see the way in which the manors are growing. Dutchess County is really growing. And this sort of population explosion continues. In a perfect world, this chart would go further for this talk. And in addition to this kind of challenge of just having so many more settlers around, this older kind of manorial world was being challenged by landlords themselves. The 1750s and 60s were a period of Anglicization, a period of imperial reform, a period of exploding consumerism. In the British Isles, this was a time when capitalism was really beginning to take root: enclosure, commercial agriculture, the beginnings of industrialization. So across the British Empire, a spirit of what elite landowners and politicians called improvement was taking root. And in the Hudson Valley, both indigenous people and tenant farmers contested these changes. They tried to defend the world they'd built together. And for the last few minutes of my talk, I'd like to really dive into a particular story in some detail from this moment, to look at a dramatic example of tenants and indigenous people contesting their landlords' efforts to make some manors more commercial, more capitalist, to replace long leases with short leases, to replace traditional customary rents paid with wheat with rent paid in money. And in the mid-1760s, in the middle of this moment, a massive tenant revolt kind of rocks the Hudson Valley. The movement was led by tenants on the northern part of the Phillips estate in southern Dutchess County, land that the Wappinger claimed never to have sold. So that's here, right? Here. And beginning in 1764, tenant farmers and squatters on this land launched a series of armed standoffs, mob actions, coordinated rent strikes, jailbreaks, actually some very dramatic mock trials. They kind of set up their own courts in the fields in protest against their landlords. At the same time, at this exact same moment, in the summer of 1766, Daniel Nimham, the leader of the Wappingers, travels to London in order to petition the British Board of Trade, the government body responsible for British imperial policy, to reaffirm the Wappingers' rights to their land on the Phillips patent in this area. And Daniel Nimham was accompanied by a group of Mohican diplomats who were there with their own petition in support of colonial squatters living on Rensselaer Manor, actually pretty close to where we are now. So the Wappingers allied themselves with rebellious tenants and squatters. They offered settlers on the Phillips patent 999-year leases with only nominal rent, such as 1 peppercorn rent. But if these Wappinger leases had little economic value, they were a powerful statement of the Wappingers' intent to stay and of their sovereignty. These Indigenous leases weren't actually so different from the small, somewhat symbolic payments that the British Crown charged to all landowners in Britain and North America. A small payment that just acknowledged this land really kind of belongs to us still. So in return for the Wappingers' support, tenant leaders took a leading role in financing the Wappingers and Mohicans' trip to London. And I believe that understanding the stakes, the significance of Wappinger and Mohican diplomacy in London in 1766 requires that we understand kind of exactly what rebellious tenants were fighting for in the Hudson Valley and vice versa. Only by looking at the tactics and motivations of tenants and Native people side by side can we begin to understand the ocean-spanning protests of 1766. So Hudson Valley tenant leaders developed a pretty succinct analysis of class and justice when they rioted. When tenant leader William Prendergast was asked why tenants didn't turn to the courts to defend their rights, he reportedly answered that there was no law for poor men, and poor men were always oppressed by the rich. However, grand claims like this, although they may perhaps be true, and they certainly illuminate tenants' worldview and tactics, have sort of distracted, I think, from the fact that the demands tenants were making were not exactly radical. Certainly there were men among them who wished that their landlords would simply disappear forever and never come back. But again and again, rebellious tenants insisted that they wanted to come to terms with their landlords. And they were pretty clear about what terms they were demanding. Leases for 3 lives on the rents which had been formerly fixed, one tenant said. So as I discussed at the beginning of the lecture, right, manorial society was in many ways defined by these customary lease terms. Leases measured in lives, not in years. Rent set by custom rather than according to the market values for land or wheat. As I mentioned earlier, most farmers pay between 15 and 20 Dutch shekels of wheat per year, plus 4 fat hens and 1 day of labor. And these rents were not nominal. They weren't necessarily low. They may have approached a third or more of a farmer's surplus production, what they had available to sell on the market. But they were predictable. And tenants owned a majority stake in the houses, farms, fences, and fields they had built or cleared on this land. In the 1760s, landlord in Phillips' heir, Beverly Robinson, here he is, and there's his fancy house that he built in the Hudson Valley, filed suits of eviction. Sorry, they do that, but not until the next paragraph. In the 1760s, Beverly Robinson, alongside his brothers-in-law Philip Phillips and Roger Morris, threw these traditional lease terms out the window. And here you can see the way in which basically after, I believe, Frederick Phillips II, but don't quote me on that, died, his children and their husbands inherit the land and they kind of divide it up between them. And then this is a map from the time of this kind of far eastern part of the Phillips patent, which is where the most sort of contestation was. Morris, Phillips, and Beverly Robinson threw these traditional lease terms out the window. Instead of leases for 3 lives, Robinson offered 1 year or at-will leases. And instead of charging rent in wheat, he wanted to charge rent in money, which exposed farmers to the fluctuating value of wheat on Atlantic markets. These changes vastly increased the uncertainty that tenant farmers faced, while increasing and regularizing landlords' incomes, right? So it's not necessarily about how much you pay, it's about how you pay and who decides how much you pay. So furthermore, between 1761 and 1764, which is when Philip Phillips and Beverly Robinson were filing suits of eviction against tenants and squatters who'd taken leases from the Wappingers, many of them. He demanded that they purchase their farms, paying money down, or remove immediately without compensation. So here, right, they're basically rewriting the rules, and they're basically stealing the farms, right? The ownership of these improvements is supposed to be shared between landlords and tenants, with tenants owning more of it, having a bigger share. And so when Robinson evicts somebody, he's stealing from them, in a sense, right? What belonged to the tenants was suddenly supposed to belong to the landlords. So Beverly Robinson, Philip Phillips, they're trying to remake a manorial economy that their families had spent the last 7 decades co-creating. That economy had been defined by long leases, rent paid in kind and wheat, usually relative autonomy for settlers, and coexistence with native people. And with that coexistence, the survival of alternative ways of living on and knowing the landscape. In place of this world, these landlords envisioned a much more capitalistic kind of agriculture, defined by short leases, money rent, and a carefully surveyed and bounded landscape. It was this model of agricultural development that provoked tenants to violence. And likewise, it was this model of agricultural development that turned a fraudulent English land claim made well over a half century earlier into an immediate threat to Wappinger land and sovereignty. So in this context, right, the Wappinger and Mohican diplomats going to London were participating in a larger debate over what it meant to own property in the Hudson Valley, over the terms on which Atlantic markets would shape colonial development. So I'm going to move on to the Wappingers in London now. I feel like this transition could have been smoother, but what can you do? In late July 1766, the Wappinger sachem Daniel Nimham arrived in England, accompanied by 3 Mohican leaders and 3 Indigenous women. Over the following months, the, quote, Indian chiefs visited attractions like Stonehenge and the Tower of London. They met with all levels of London society, including some of the city's most prominent political figures. They became both spectators and attractions at a London pleasure garden. You can see that in this newspaper ad here, Marylebone Gardens, advertising musical entertainments in honor of the Indian chief and their ladies. They had their every move reported on by the London press, as you can see on my slide. And everywhere they went, they carefully presented themselves as both sophisticated, fashionable Britons and, quote unquote, savage Indians, playing off British expectations. So often, for example, the women would dress as English ladies, while the men would wear a combination of indigenous clothes and fashionable English accessories. When they were finally called to make, this was really savvy, right? This is smart. They're playing off the expectations of people in London to sort of support their political cause in a really smart way, as all great diplomats do, right? When they were finally called to make their case before the Board of Trade, the Wappingers and Mohicans presented complementary but very different petitions. The Wappingers, who lived on the land contested by William Prendergast and his mob, didn't say anything about that. They claimed that that land had been stolen, that Frederick Phillips' 1697 colonial land patent was illegitimate because he had never purchased native title. Again, probably true. This should not surprise us. As we've seen, 17th century landowners often acquired the government patent first and purchased land from native people second, even though legally they were supposed to do it the other way around. In the 1730s and 40s, the Wappingers had successfully defended their claims through force and persuasion. By the 1760s, that strategy was no longer working on the ground. So instead, they tried to achieve redress through the imperial courts, presenting themselves as both British and native, as simultaneously foreign diplomats and petitioning subjects. The Mohicans presented a very different argument to the crown than the Wappingers. The Mohican petition was on behalf of Massachusetts settlers living on the New York side of the Massachusetts border, on land that the Van Rensselaer family claimed as part of their manor. And this is the part of Rensselaer Manor that is now in Columbia County. So the areas under dispute were here, Nobletown, Spencertown, both settled by people from Massachusetts, both on the New York side of the border, which these people did not like. They were like, we're from Massachusetts, wherever we go should be Massachusetts. I I also think it's worth noting that you have a very strong black line on the eastern border of the top part of Rensselaer Manor, and you have a very strong black line on the eastern border of Livingston Manor. And this mapmaker in 1776 was like, we're just not going to put a line on this part of Rensselaer Manor. We're not sure what's going on there, but they seem to be in a fight over it, so we'll just leave it open. So like in southern Dutchess County, this area had been rocked by violence in the 1750s and 60s. But unlike on the Phillips estate, where tenants had led the charge, the violence on Rensselaer Manor seems to really have been provoked by the Van Rensselaers themselves, basically as a pretext for evictions. And the core of the Mohican petition was basically a protest against the Van Rensselaers' unwarranted violence. And the Mohicans, they didn't really ask for anything for themselves. They basically say, you know, we, the Indians of Stockbridge, belong to your excellency, and we want to know how we should behave in these circumstances. Whether we may engage in this quarrel or not is the words they use. So these two petitions of the Wappingers and Mohicans complement each other very artfully. The Wappingers' land had been stolen, they claim. They'd pursued justice through the colonial legal system and not received it, and now they turn to the king to affirm their rights. The Mohicans, who'd already sold much of their rights to land in New York to Massachusetts settlers, didn't press a land claim. Instead, they complained on behalf of those settlers, whom they presented as English, against New York landlords, who they conveniently presented as Dutch. The Wappingers had a strong land claim, right? But the violence in their homeland had been driven by tenants, and whatever the merits of the tenants' cause, kidnapping justices, beating up government officials, all of this was super illegal. The Mohicans didn't really have a land claim, but unrest on their homeland had been much more clearly provoked by landlords. And so by marrying the Wappinger land claim to the Mohican story about unrest, the two petitions really cleverly presented a very unflattering view of New York's government and put both nations' struggles in absolutely the best possible light. In one sense, this strategy worked beautifully. The Wappingers and Mohicans very much won over the Earl of Shelburne, who was the Secretary of State for the Southern Department in this period, basically in charge of the American colonies. And he and the Board of Trade, which met at Whitehall, this is Whitehall, the Board of Trade, I think met just off the screen over here over the Treasury offices, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So the Board of Trade and Shelburne prepared a very sympathetic report about the Wappinger and Mohican petitions for the king. Unfortunately, there wasn't really much that even the king himself could do for the Wappingers. Despite a strongly worded letter from Shelburne to the governor of New York, the Wappingers did not win their land case. The governor put on a big show of rehearing everything. It took 2 days, and then, of course, ruled against them yet again. Likewise, the tenant rebellion was utterly crushed by British troops deployed by the governor that summer. And on the heels of that crushing military defeat, Beverly Robinson raised the average rent on his part of the Phillips estate by 82% between 1766 and 1777. In other words, failure all around. But these failures should not obscure the extraordinary nature of the effort, right? Fundamentally, both the Wappingers and tenant activists were contesting the terms of economic development and colonial governments. They were contesting the very meaning of property in the Hudson Valley. As I've already said, for the Wappingers, writing leases for settlers was itself a meaningful statement, a powerful statement, in fact, of Indigenous sovereignty and presence. And tenants were fighting to preserve a vision of manorial agriculture in which property rights were distributed between landlords and tenant farmers, neither of whom had an absolute right to the land. Together, these actions represent a dramatic moment of basically interracial, intercultural resistance to the political and economic changes of the 1760s, to the intensification of colonial governments and the turn towards capitalist agriculture across Britain and its empire. But we can only see this significance, we can only understand this moment in the way that I've just laid it out in 1766. We can only see its potential, its resonance, when we recognize that colonial property in the Hudson Valley was relational, was negotiated, when we recognize that Indigenous and colonial understandings of and relationships to the land were interwoven in the Hudson Valley from the beginning. Thank you. And I do believe I have a little bit of time for questions. Do I have to call on people? I can call on people. Go ahead.
I'm curious whether the property relations and general terms you described in this region extended north of Albany and west of Berkshire County and or east of Berkshire County and west into western New York, or is it different kinds of relationship?
So I'm going to go back to the map right at the beginning to answer this question. So in the colonial period, right, there is no Western New York. Western New York is Haudenosaunee territory. There's no question of New Yorkers inhabiting that land before the American Revolution. Like really no question. Maybe in some people in the back of their minds are thinking one day, but it's not a realistic thought at all. In terms of what settlement looks like going north, so immediately north of Albany, you do have places that are set up kind of on this model. People like William Cooper in the early 19th century are kind of trying to do something similar to this model in Western New York after the American Revolution. In Vermont, in this area, it's not Vermont at the time, it's part of New York, or it's claimed by both New York and New Hampshire. New York has the better legal case. All the people are from New Hampshire. So in that area, you have some attempts to kind of set up this kind of system, but it doesn't get off the ground, right? Ordinary farmers don't like this. They don't want to be tenants. They'd much rather just own their farms altogether. And so it's a large system, but in some ways it's kind of contained to this part of the Hudson Valley. But again, as this map shows, the part of the Hudson Valley where this is the dominant system is, a huge part of the settled part of New York. But on the west side of the Hudson River, it's mostly not manorial. It's mostly freehold farming.
Who's the author of that 1776 map?
No clue. I have it, of course, in my notes, but I don't have it off the top of my head. He was British, though. I do believe he was British.
One other question about maps, the 1714 Beatty map. For all these years, I've been sort of using that, thinking it's pretty authentic, and you say you have questions about it?
So there's a good article about this that was published in New York History in like 2014 that you should look at. That article is like, there's no way this map is authentic. I'm a little bit more skeptical than him. I think, sorry, I'm trying to get to it. It's this one, right?
That's 167,240 acres of living.
So this map is based, there really is a survey done in this period in 1714. We have quite extensive notes from that survey. We have surveying notes. We also have Robert Livingston's personal journal of that survey.
Right, and he wrote the whole thing in this.
So maybe he wrote the whole thing, or maybe he kind of went halfway and said, good enough.
It's mostly the border between Connecticut and stuff that was in question, because he was all the way over into Lakeville and stuff because of that was the original, what he thought.
Yeah, so there's a good map of this somewhere, and I wish I knew exactly where it was. No, it's got to be earlier than that. Here, you can see that this is the border between Connecticut and Massachusetts and New York in red. And so Livingston Manor was supposed to be all in New York, and it wasn't. And this does create a huge problem. But yeah, so the 1714 map, I still use it. I still think it's valuable. It's unclear, I think, whether it was copied from a 1714 original in 1850 or whether it was extrapolated from this sort of huge set of notes. So again, very useful, but not necessarily exactly authentic. The question in the back on the right has been a while.
You talked about this guy Reynolds, who kind of put forth that he had a new concept of what rent was going to look like and what ownership looked like. But where did he get those ideas from? That doesn't just sort of come out of thin air. Why was that changing at that time? That this guy could put forth this new notion?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. So these new ideas, right, are much more first off, they're much more like how we think about land ownership today than manorial land is. And they were kind of in vogue in England and in Europe in general. So I don't know, it's tough because I have so much I could say about this and I'm not exactly sure what to say. But basically in England, right, you have like a 3-century process of turning land from like a pre-capitalist manorial system where most people have land on something called copyholds that looks like what I've been describing, right? Often they last for 3 lives. The rent is customary. It often includes funny things like pepper or hens or geese. To enclosed, bounded landscape in which it's very clear what everyone owns, and if you own land, you own land, right? And this process is called enclosure, and it's contested, and it lasts for centuries. And what's happening in North America in the 1760s is like a piece of this, right? This is a moment across the entire British Empire when, economic development is just really picking up. The economy is growing. This is the period when the British Parliament starts to do something called parliamentary enclosures, which is where they go onto English manors and basically declare by law that now all the land is going to, this land's going to belong to this person and this land's going to belong to this person, instead of having these kind of negotiated tangle of traditional rights. So absolutely, it's part of an Atlantic moment, but I'm not sure if I'm doing justice to it. Yeah, over here.
Yeah, just as a point of information, I believe the earlier map, the 1776 map, is referred to sometimes as the Salpier or Saupier map. If someone's looking for it, you can find it in your historical society website, things like that. I actually live very close to where the word Moana-Quasic is written there, and I've looked endlessly at that map and find it just bizarre. That's another topic. The one thing I will say is there are piles of stone, very large piles of stone, all over that area. And I have no doubt that it was not difficult for the Livingstons or the Van Rensselaers to find some Mohican who would say, oh yeah, it was that pile over there. But I'm dubious that that was honestly a collaborative process or a happy one for most Mohicans. And the other point of information I want to bring forward before I get to my question is that, we've sort of started, although you went back a little bit, at the end of the 17th century, but from what I've read, between 90 and 95% of the Mohicans in Columbia County, at least, were gone by then. So those who remained were the ones who had found some way to coexist. But I sort of dispute the idea that this was a happy relationship as opposed to one of survival for those who stuck around. And part of the reason I say that is that the word that comes up over and over again, going all the way back to John Jay at the New York State Convention in 1777, New York State legislature in the legislature in 1854, Frank Leonard Pope in the 1880s, writing about the border dispute between New York and Massachusetts, Oscar Handlin in the 1930s. The word that comes up over and over again is the fraud that was perpetrated by the Livingstons, the Van Rensselaers, and other manor-lords against the Indians. So perhaps I'm misunderstanding what you were saying, but I just was sort of surprised to hear that relationship described as one of collaboration, because I really feel like if there was collaboration, it was, if not at the point of a gun, but it was sort of the only way for those remaining Mohicans to survive. And I just wonder what your reaction to it.
I'm going to address this question at length. I do think that this talk that I just gave presents maybe too much collaboration in that period and not enough violence. And I would say that I think most people who have written about this have seen no collaboration, but that there's a huge amount of violence, and my project as a whole is filled with a huge amount of violence. I do think, I want to address a few things you said. The first thing I want to address is about the process of Indigenous people helping to locate boundaries. There, I actually do think I disagree with most historians who've written about this. In the colonial period, even, you have a lot of people, you have a lot of documents, people saying, you can, find a native person who will say anything. So native testimony is useless. You see this criticism levied all the time, and yet you also see native people being called upon to locate landmarks, and then those locations being accepted by everybody. And so I think that that debate is kind of ongoing. I do think that ultimately there was a certain amount of a collaborative process between some of these people. Again, there is a lot of violence, and part of what I'm interested in is the moment when violence arrives, right? So for me, you start to see a much more explicitly violent relationship once you start to get lots of settlers moving into a place, right? And that's when everything has to be renegotiated. And so in the 1680s and 90s, in the early 18th century, I think Mohican people and landlords like the Livingstons, again, it's very violent. And also these families are deeply, deeply invested in slavery, which is something I write about a lot. And I think in my project as a whole helps, like no one comes out of reading my manuscript and thinks, oh, the Livingstons, great people, super collaborative. They don't come off well. And so that's another thing that I think is missing from this talk. But I do think that they have a more collaborative relationship in the beginning, and that relationship gets tested as more settlers come and as they want things. And there are inflection points where surveys get done and people do get forced to leave. So a lot of Mohicans, I believe, leave in the 1740s when the Moravian missionaries get kicked out of New York, and a lot of Mohicans go with them. But I also am wary of, no one counted native people in the 18th century. Just period, full stop, nobody. You have little people now and again talking about how many fighting men came from this area or that area. We don't really know how many people there were. And so I'm always very wary when it looks like there's nobody, because people have a tendency to imagine that if there's no evidence of people, that 5 people is more likely than 30 people. But that's not really true, actually. If there's no evidence, there's just no evidence. There might be 5 people, there might be 30 people. There's probably not 5,000 people, because that would probably produce evidence, right? But there's a tendency to trust the low number over the middle number that I don't know is always warranted. But I could talk much more about your objections. Thank you.
Where were the Palatines in the midst of all this?
You guys know things, which is amazing.
Well, so both of us are pastors, and I was the pastor of the Livingston Memorial Church for a short time. So I got to stand over the bodies of these people. But he's descended from the Palatines, so there's all this stuff that comes together.
Yeah, so I write a lot about the Palatines. Again, you kind of pull out what you're going to try and give a lecture on, and you do the best you can. But I will say, I know you weren't meaning to criticize me. So the Palatines are, let me see.
Well, I guess in terms of the tenant, when you talk about the tenants
Yeah.
and their rebellion, they would have been part of that?
So a little bit, but not really. Not as Palatines, right? So there's a lot, the Palatines are settled like here and then down through Rhinebeck, basically. This is like the center of Palatine settlement in the Hudson Valley. Of course, a lot of people go out further west. And many Palatine Germans do take leases from the Beekmans and the Livingstons. But by the time you get to the period of unrest in the 1740s, 50s, 60s, you're just seeing those people as tenants and trying to figure out if they're German Palatines or not would basically mean like looking at everyone's surnames and trying to figure out, which I haven't done. But the one thing I do want to say is that the Palatines do play this kind of key role in relationships between Mohicans and settlers because the presence of the Palatine Germans in this area is why German-speaking Moravian missionaries come here. And the arrival of German-speaking Moravians does have important consequences for Mohican communities.
Thank you.
There's a great book called Becoming German that you should look into.
Wonderful, wonderful book. I've read it twice, I believe.
Would you see this as being a portion of a timeline that started when the first settlers came to this region and when the native people were finally pushed out? Like it's a piece of the story, and if you do, what are the other pieces of there? Just the broad terms, changes in relationships and.
Can you tell us what the question was? We can't hear it back here.
So the question was, is this a piece of a larger story? And if so, what are the other sides of it? And the answer to that question is absolutely. You can tell a story about relations between settlers and indigenous people during the American Revolution and the period immediately after. You could tell a story quite similar to this in New Netherland. Land ownership and property look quite different under the Dutch law. This is something which I've been forced to deal with in my academic writing. I have not super found a way to make it remotely accessible. But I will say that my period that I've researched is 1674 to 1766. And that's already actually a really big span for a historian. So I'm not necessarily going to talk authoritatively about New Netherland or about the early American Republic. There's a question in the back.
Are you familiar with the research by Deborah Winchell and John Van Gilder?
Yes.
How
Yes.
that factors into the that area in Australia?
Yes, I have. I am. And that actually is something that I started to look into and try to incorporate into this story. And then my dissertation advisor was like, okay, come on. And I just was like, okay, I'll get to that. I'll think about that later. And I haven't thought about it since. So at some point I'll look back into that, but it sort of fell out of the project for practical reasons.
Her thesis indicates that the conflicts between the Livingstons and the Mohicans was the instigator for this area in the rent wars, which is a thesis that I haven't come across in other perspectives. A lot of it presents it that the Mohicans were not involved with the rent wars, that it was the Mohawks that were. So it would be interesting if that became part of your thesis.
Yeah. It's something I'm interested in for sure.
Are you saying that's in Austerlitz?
It's Egeron, Austerlitz, Hillsdale.
That's quite a ways from the Livingston map.
No. The Livingston's going into Boston.
You guys probably know this area better than I do, I must say. Yeah.
The map that you're showing shows Clarbrook just to the north of the northern boundary.
Right.
Well, that's quite a ways from Austerlitz.
That's because Livingston had two different properties that we blended together.
So that's not the only Livingston
This is just
now?
the western one.
It gets very confusing because everyone marries everyone else, and it becomes quite messy, I must say. More questions? Yeah, white sweater.
So you were talking about all the violence that was going on. Was the French Indian War, was that fought at all in this area? Because that's the 1750s, and how did that affect some of what you talked about?
Yeah. So lucky for you, I cut the French and Indian War yesterday. I said, you know what? I actually needed to cut a lot of things yesterday. I had an hour and 5-minute talk yesterday morning. And one of those things was the French and Indian War. The Stockbridge Mohicans and the Wappingers fight in the 7 Years' War for the British. And that is a big part of, they basically say that to the king when they go to London. They're like, by the way, we fought for you guys in the 7 Years' War. Also, it's while they're away fighting in the 7 Years' War that they lose the territory. The Wappingers leave this part of the southern Hudson Valley when the 7 Year War when the 7 Years' War breaks out. It's not exactly clear to me why. It's pretty easy to imagine why, and a lot of books will kind of imagine why, but I don't know exactly why they don't feel safe in this area. But they don't feel safe in this area. And so they go and they join the Mohicans at Stockbridge in Western Massachusetts. And it's when the war ends and they come back that all of these problems start. Other questions? Maybe one more, and then no one ever told me when this was supposed to end, but it can't go on forever.
Is your work published online or elsewhere?
My work is mostly unpublished at the moment, but my email is easy to find. Yeah, here.
I'd like to go back to the Palatines for a minute if we could. On the Livingston Manor with the rent wars, the guy that was comparable to Pendergast was Philip Finkel. And that was the first, he was a Palatine, there was a lot of Palatines that lived in that area. What Livingston did, he would offer them land on the Massachusetts border as a buffer, so these, Massachusetts people wouldn't be coming in.
Yeah, exactly. And I will say the ethnic politics of this and the just politics of this are quite involved. And I'm constantly running into a problem of like trying to simplify enough to tell a story that makes sense and sort of losing some of that detail. I'm going to take one more question from right behind you.
I learned a lot. Thank you. I usually think forward and looking through history, and it seems like I saw like the birth of privatization of land here in New York. And I was really struck by seeing this manor is the size of our county, basically. And I work in real estate, and I'm looking at tax maps all the time. And you look at the city of Hudson, there's thousands of little itty microscopic private. And I'm just wondering, in the arc of time, maybe in the next 200 years, what, like, it's gone so microscopic, and there's subdivisions, and everybody's like, I'm wondering what you see maybe in the next 200 years.
Yeah, this is a fun question, actually. I love this question. We're not going back to a manorial system for sure. Although there's pretty interesting work being done on the idea of like techno-feudalism, right? Which is basically the idea that now that we're in an information economy, that information economy is not really functioning as a free market economy. It's functioning more as like a feudal economy with, large tech firms basically like renting out land to all of us on the internet, and we kind of have to play by their rules, and we sort of feel like we own our information, but we don't actually, right? So in that sense, there's maybe a lot of resonance between these questions about who owns land, who owns anything, what it means to own property going forward. And with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you all for coming.